Yo, what is going on, guys? Today I'm going to be ranking and reviewing the entire Fear Street trilogy, which is a brand new trilogy of movies that released on Netflix the past 3 or so weeks, and they're pretty interesting. So I saw some of the teasers and some of the trailers for it, and it gave me a lot of Stranger Things vibes just based on the era it was set in. Obviously, it's not in the 80s. Stranger Things was in the 80s, but it was in, for part of it, the late or the early 90s. Another part of it was the late 70s. So it was kind of around that era, that general time period. So it definitely was something I was excited to watch. It had a lot of teenagers in it as well. But it didn't really seem like it was gonna be what I thought it was gonna be. I thought it was gonna be more like a teen slasher drama thing going on, where it was gonna be very much centered for teenagers, which in a way it was, but they didn't really hold back on the mature gore within this series and a lot of the mature themes that it kind of focused on. So it was partially for teens, it felt like, but at the same time, it definitely also felt like it could be really enjoyable for a more mature audience, which is one of the things I definitely enjoyed about it. But that does not mean this little trilogy here was perfect. There's a lot of issues I had with it, and we're going to talk about all those issues and all the good things as well here in this video. We're not going to go worst to best ranking these 3 films. Rather, we're just going to go in chronological order. Well, not chronological order in how they released, not in how the story went, because the story was going through all sorts of eras throughout the entire trilogy. But we're going to go from part 1 to 2 to 3, give them a ranking out of 10, and then we'll talk about at the end my thoughts on the entire trilogy and how it all kind of wrapped up. Starting off with Fear Street Part 1, which is of course 1994. This one I think was good, but not great, and we'll give it a score at the end. I'm going to go through my positives and then we'll get to some of the negatives here. In terms of the positives, the time period, very atmospheric. I mean, with the music, the clothing, the dialogue, the locations that they were going to within the movie, very atmospheric for the sort of mid-90s. And the music was one of the best parts about it, honestly. Although they kind of overplayed the music, it was almost like it was a music video at certain points. They were just consistently throwing all sorts of great songs, mind you, though. They were great songs, but there were so many of them, it was getting a little bit too much. But it fit the tone of the film, so I definitely wasn't against it. And I think most of the kills in this movie were pretty great. I think that's probably the best part about any slasher, really, is the kills usually. So definitely enjoyed a lot of the kills. Not all of them were the best kills I've ever seen in slashers, but a couple of them, especially like Kate's death, where her face went through that bread slicer in the grocery store, that one was awesome. And there was a couple others here and there that I thought were pretty cool as well. By far the best part of this film, and actually probably the best part of the whole trilogy, are the slasher characters themselves. Now, we don't really get to learn the whole story of each individual slasher, but we get to learn a couple of their stories. And I really wanted to see more from these stories, but part 3 kind of ruined the idea of these slashers for me personally. I know this is all based off of R.L. Stine's novels, and he has a whole series of them apparently, kind of like his Goosebumps series. I have not read any of them, so I don't know what the books were like compared to these. I'm just going to be reviewing and ranking these themselves, not taking the books into account at all. I really liked the slashers specifically in this film though, and was very intrigued to see more of them. Like I said, the 3rd one kind of ruined that for me for obvious reasons, but still really awesome. You have Ryan Torres, which was the one who wore the skull mask. He was the one who killed that Heather girl in the beginning in the mall. He was a very typical Ghostface-like slasher. I thought he was pretty cool. A lot of these killers kind of paid homage to other slashers, which I thought was really cool. You have Tommy Slater as the Camp Nightwing killer. He's the one we saw in part 2. He definitely was paying homage to Sackhead Jason from the Friday the 13th Part 2. I thought that was really cool how they had the sack over his head. Obviously in Part 2, for most of it, he wasn't wearing the sack on his head, but halfway through the movie, or a little bit more than halfway through, he got it on his head. That was really cool. We'll talk about that in Part 2 as well. You have Ruby Lane, which I really wanted to see more of her because she was probably the coolest out of all of them just by her aesthetic alone. The fact that she was singing that weird creepy ass song every time she came in. I mean, her presence in every scene was just like really good. I would love to see just a whole movie based on her story, her backstory. That would have been fantastic. I believe I read into a little bit. I think her story was set in the 60s and she killed a whole bunch of her friends with a razor blade or something. don't really know the whole story about that, but I really thought that was interesting. You have this Billy Barker kid who was the one wearing that weird creepy mask, and he killed, I think, his family with a baseball bat or something. You have Cyrus Miller, who was the pastor that we see in part 3, who gouged out all those kids' eyes. Just some really disgusting, dark stories of these killers, and I was really interested to learn more about them, but part 3, again, kind of ruins that a little bit for me. But in terms of what it was in part 1, still very intrigued to see what was going on, and I really wanted them to focus even more on this. And everything else going on in this film, I think there was some really positive stuff with these characters. I just don't like these characters that much, right? A few of them I do. I think Dina is an interesting character for the most part. Also, her sister Josh, I think, is probably one of the better characters. Sam, on the other hand, we didn't really learn much about her. She was just kind of there to be Dina's girlfriend, really. And then Kate and Simon, I know most slashers need these really obnoxious characters. They usually have them, and they usually are used as cannon fodder, but they were just way too present in the movie, and I just wanted to die every time they were on screen. I just did not like them at all. And I know you're not really supposed to, but I want to at least be able to deal with them, and they were unbearable. But again, I think a big issue with this movie is that although it felt like the characters had more development to be given maybe in future films, they don't really get that at all, other than maybe Dina and maybe Josh to a degree. So I really think this movie had a really good setup, but I just don't think the other ones finished it off all that well, which kind of brings this one down slightly. I also think the whole Shady Side versus Sunnyvale thing, they didn't really do much with it. Like, we passed maybe, I guess the second one focused on it a lot, but I mean, the third one didn't really do much with it either, so it didn't really feel like it had a good closing to it. It almost felt kind of left behind, like it was a story that they didn't really continue with. And we didn't really learn much about Sunnyvale anyways, other than the whole thing with Nick Good, which we see later. So, I don't know. I wasn't a big, huge fan of some of the actual story in this between the characters and the town itself, but in terms of the slashers and everything going on with that, and the actual curse itself that was going on, and the whole mystery behind this like Sarah Fear character, I was all in for that, and I really enjoyed all of that, and I think Fear Street Part 1 did a great job of setting all that up. I think as a whole, I would give Fear Street Part 1 like a 6.5 out of 10, which a 6.5 out of 10 is not a bad score at all. 5 out of 10 would be like an average film where it has the same amount of positives as negatives. So 6.5 out of 10 is like, it's a good movie, it's just not in the great territory just yet. But then we get into Fear Street Part 2, and I love this one. This is by far my favorite of the trilogy. It's the only one from the trilogy I think I would like to rewatch again, because that's how much I enjoyed it. It almost worked really well as its own story even. Like it feels like it could be kind of stripped from this trilogy and it be its own slasher and almost work. Obviously a lot of the other story with the whole Sarah Fear curse going on wouldn't really make sense without having part 1 and part 3 there to kind of tie up the loose ends, but other than that, it does feel like a pretty self-contained story. First of all, the whole aesthetic of this late 70s, kind of early 80s theme that has going on is amazing. Obviously, it takes place in 1978, and it has obviously a lot of homages to Friday the 13th. That's very obvious, with being set at a camp, and of course the slasher being this person who eventually gets a sack over his head, just like Sackhead Jason. I'm assuming they were trying to pay homage to that. Easily the best slasher out of all of them, in my opinion, when it comes to the slashers that were heavily present in the story. Obviously, I think Ruby Lane is one of the coolest looking, but she wasn't always there. We do see her again later in this movie as well. But Tommy Slater as this Camp Nightwing killer with that really dope looking axe, he was badass. And even when he didn't have the sack on his head, he just had his hair coming down. He looked terrifying, and all his kills were brutal as hell. I mean, he was just taking this axe, slashing people up. There was kids dying in this. It was really dark, and I felt like in terms of the intensity and everything that was being built up was just incredibly good in this one. And I love the characters in this one. I actually think the characters in this one are a lot stronger than the other two films. You have, of course, Ziggy, which we see in part 1 and part 3, mostly in part 3 when she's older, obviously, and she changed her name and everything. But we see a younger version of Ziggy here, and she was very interesting to watch. You, of course, have Nick Good as a younger kid as well. You have Sydney, which was, of course, Ziggy's sister. You have Alice, which was the girl with the shorter hair. And you have, of course, you know, a couple other characters. You have Tommy Slater, which was the slasher. Actual characters that I kind of felt interested in their stories as they went along. I think one of the most interesting parts was Sydney and Alice and their kind of massive differences from one another when they were going through the caves and they were kind of stuck down there, and they clearly didn't like each other before, because Sydney's this very, you know, goody-goody girl who's very kind of uptight, always follows the rules, whereas Alice is kind of like, you know, the bad girl, the goth girl, I guess you can call her, where she's just kind of breaking the rules all the time, doesn't really give a shit, but has a lot more fun. And you kind of see this difference between the two. And a big theme that is played with in this entire trilogy, not just in this one, is the difference between innocence and not being innocent, essentially. And that's the whole thing with this whole curse. I mean, that's what the whole curse was blamed on, which we see in part 3, is the fact that you're not innocent, right? And then the whole Nick Good's whole philosophy later on, one, I guess the Good family as a whole, their whole philosophy is essentially that no one's innocent, right? But this film played a lot with that, where you have Sydney being this very innocent person and Alice clearly not being this very innocent person. And same with Ziggy even. She was kind of very different than Sydney, where she just wanted to not really follow all these rules that Sydney was trying to abide by, and just trying to keep all the consistency, order, and all that stuff. And she just kind of wanted to not do that because she had a lot of issues with the town. She felt like the town was cursed. Of course, she ended up being right. And we kind of learned a little bit more about the curse here. And this is where I feel like the story, in the terms of the curse, was probably progressing the most out of any of them, even though it was a flashback, you know, before the present time. So you wouldn't think it's going to progress the story nearly as much as the 1994 stuff would. But I felt like it did. It gave us so much more information on the curse, and I was all very much interested in everything going on there. You also see all the killers return from part 1 in a certain scene later on in the film, which was, of course, really interesting to see. Definitely very intense stuff. And yeah, I think this just works really, really well. I think the only issues with it is that the other two parts hold it back a little bit. I do think this story, being self-contained, it has a lot of issues because the solution in the final film, what kind of wraps it all up, I didn't like the answers. I didn't like the final reveal in the third part, which we'll get to, which definitely holds back this one, because it definitely really does rely on the next one. Because we learn about the curse, but we don't learn about everything. You know, we don't want to see everything. We want to be able to get the final answers. And when we do get the answers, it has to be good for the answers we get in this one to work. You know what I mean? So definitely a much more enjoyable film. I do think it did have a couple pacing issues, maybe towards the middle of the film, or maybe not towards the middle, but towards like the first half. But as a whole, definitely the best of the trilogy. I would give it a nice 7.5 out of 10, which 7.5 out of 10 is a great movie. I don't think any of these are like going to be the best slasher films ever, which is why they're not getting like 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 scores, because they're definitely not going to be that high up for me. But as a Netflix movie, especially a Netflix movie in 2021, because honestly, Netflix movies, no offense, usually not very good. I've seen a lot of Netflix originals. They're usually pretty bad. This is one of the only Netflix originals, especially horror originals, that I actually enjoyed for the most part. So part 2, definitely the best of the 3. Gonna give it a 7.5 out of 10. Then we get to part 3. Part 3, 1666, my least favorite out of all of them. I was not a big fan of this one, but not everything about it though. So the first half of it was unbearable. I'll just admit it right there. The first half of this film, I think, was not good, right? The second half is what saves it for me and makes it a decent film. But the first half, everything in 1666 essentially, I did not care. I just did not care. It was essentially trying to tell us something, right? It was trying to give us the explanation for what happened with Sarah Fear back in 1660, which was something we're all wondering, right? We all wanted to know. But they could have given us the answer for that within a 5-minute margin. They didn't need to have a whole hour of the film be that. And I know that's the whole point of the movie. It was 1666, so I was fully expecting that when I got into it. But did I really want that? No. I wanted the answers, yes, but I didn't want to spend a dragged out hour of the film getting to that point. And to make it even worse, it just was not well executed at all. You have all the characters, all the actors, I guess you could say, from the previous films playing parts in this 1666 world with Sarah Fear. It only made sense for Dina to be there because she was kind of seeing the story through her eyes. Maybe seeing some of her friends there makes sense as well. But like, why is she seeing characters from like part 2 that she's never even met in her life in this dream? That made no sense. That was clearly just the fact that they wanted to use the actors for more things because they didn't want to get new actors. So they're like, okay, we'll just use the actors we already have in different roles. But it made it felt like I was watching like a middle school play for like the Salem witch trials or something. And I was just like, ugh, the whole time. And these actors are good, don't get me wrong, but their accents, like obviously they put in a more 1666, persona because they had to, change up the dialogue and stuff, but it sounded so forced, the accents and the dialogue, and I was just like, oh, this is not good. This is not good. It was just a lot of exposition that took so long to get there, and I didn't even like the resolution to it. I didn't even like the answer to it. So essentially, what they made it seem like, and I'm not sure if this is what they meant, we obviously had the story going on in part 1, which I really liked this story. You had Dina and Sam having this gay relationship with each other, and obviously they were trying to hide it from people because it was the 90s, back when a lot of this stuff wasn't really accepted by a lot of people, so they were trying to hide it. Even their mother wasn't very accepting of it. I like that story. I thought that storyline was good. I thought it was solid. But they did the same thing here, which was really weird. It's like, are you trying to tell me that this Sarah Fear had the exact same story as Dina, pretty much word for word, like in terms of that relationship thing going on, and that's how they're connected to each other? I know they were trying to make a parallel, but like, it just did not work for me, especially because it was already done in part 1, and it seems like they were trying to make that the catalyst for the entire thing that happens. Like, you're telling me them having that relationship is why all of this is happening in future movies? Or in future, I guess, decades? I don't know. I don't know if they were trying to make it seem like that was the case, or if it was just the fact that they were fooling around in general. Whether or not it was a gay relationship or not doesn't matter. It was just the fact that people were, doing that in that time period, which they obviously weren't really supposed to do anything like that, unless it was for the purpose of procreation, I guess. I don't really know. But I don't know if that's what they were against, if that's what all the people were freaking out about, or if it was specifically because of the fact that they were gay. I don't know what they were trying to go for there. Either way, I feel like that's a weird way to explain everything that's happening. It's that for that to be the catalyst for the entire curse, that the whole curse that goes on Shadyside and all the slashers that come for years going onward, all because of this Solomon character who was obviously one of the goods. That is just such a weird explanation for it. I wasn't a fan of it. And then we get back to 1994, and that's when things start getting a little more interesting because we're getting the final solutions to everything here. They essentially just need to kill Nick Good. That's essentially the way to stop this all. And I like their whole plan. I like how they do the whole Carrie trick on him, get the blood poured on his head in the mall. I thought that was really cool. And they eventually do succeed. And all the scenes with all the slashers coming back and then having to fight them off in the mall, it was good stuff. I enjoyed that. But the first half of the film it ruined it for me. It really did. But in terms of how they ended it off, it definitely held it up a bit. And I thought there was also a lot of cheesy moments in this one. I mean, there was cheesy moments throughout the entirety of the couple films, but this one had some of the worst. Like the whole scene when she was like for Shadyside, it was just like trying to make it more epic than it was. And I was just like, I don't know. I just didn't care for it. I mean, maybe for you it was really awesome, and that's great. I felt like it was cheesy, really cheesy. I don't think it was the actor's fault, not at all, not their fault, but it was more so the dialogue that just did not come off correctly, and I was like, that's just, no. But I think the solution in the end, they had the characters surviving, which is different for horror. Usually they have horror having pretty, crappy endings usually. I thought the ending was fine. A couple of characters survived, and they have a little hint of there being another one because some character picks up the book that was within the caves. So maybe we'll get a sequel, or I guess, would you call it a sequel? Because it's already a trilogy. I don't know. A sequel to the trilogy, maybe? I don't know. So just because of that first half, I'd probably give part 3 like a 5 out of 10, which is an average score. I don't think it's a bad movie by any means, but very average. So that's going to do it for the ranking and reviewing of all 3 movies from the Fear Street trilogy. I thought this was an enjoyable little thing that Netflix did. It was interesting how they released them all within, 3 different weeks. So I hope they kind of do more with this. I think there's a lot more to be done. There's a lot more stories to be told within these slashers, but as a whole, enjoyable. Not the greatest slashers you're ever going to watch, but for a Netflix original, pretty damn good. I like it. So hopefully you guys enjoyed. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.